Okay, so do we call Besaki to start the session? Just introduce our speaker, Besaki, and then invite Amlan to speak on it. Okay? And then we will have a question answer session. Besaki, please start.
Yes, sir. A very good afternoon to one and all present here. It's exceedingly a delight for me. This live where I thus meet. Intersections is an informal academic platform. The purpose of this online lecture is to address young minds, scholars, academicians, and mostly teaching students, and bring about an awareness of the recent and ongoing studies in the sphere of academics. Today, we have among our speaker, Professor Amlan Dasgupta, a former professor of Jadavpur University, Kolkata. He is a noted scholar and biblical studies, English Renaissance literature, and an authority on Miltonic Studies in India, having numerous publications to his credit. Sir did his graduation from Presidency College and went on to pursue masters at Jadavpur University. He received his MPhil from Oxford University and received his Ph.D. from Jadavpur University. His current interest lies in classical European thought, history of Christianity, Renaissance English literature, and history of Indian music. Here are a few of his publications. Determine Things, Part and Comic Structure in Measure for Jonathan Edwards on Freedom and Foreknowledge. He also built an archive of non-Indian classical music at the School of Cultural Texts and Records at Jadavpur University. Now, before we begin, I have a few requests to the participants. Participants are requested. All the questions will be read out by me in a chronological order in the question-answer session, which shall be conducted post-lecture. I also humbly request all the participants to mute themselves and not to share their screen. Thank you. So without further delay, I, on behalf of Intersections,
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Fine. So, thank you very much for asking me to speak. And I thought that given the subject, I would try to say a little bit about something which is fairly central and fairly basic to anybody pursuing Renaissance studies of any kind, say, maybe of its many possible manifestations. So, I've titled this lecture The Beginnings of Renaissance Humanism. And as you will be aware, that this is a subject on which you can say a great deal, because I have also taught whole courses on Renaissance humanism. When I taught at Jadavpur University, I taught a whole semester course on Renaissance humanism. So I can only say a few things today. Obviously, that's not the point. The point is really to be able to say something which might be of interest and value to you and suggest some possibilities for further reading, further research. Now, I can share, if you like, at some time later, a reading list or even some of the texts. We had these Dropbox collections where all the members of the class, they contributed whatever material they had. So we have a fairly large repository now. So you're welcome to that. And share it with Vivek, and we can pass it on to all of you. Okay. Right. So let me start by getting into the topic straight away and saying and asking these two questions. One is that was there a Renaissance, and if so, what was it like, or what was it about? The second question I'd like to place in front of you is that what does humanism mean, and what do we mean when we say Renaissance humanism? These are the two questions that I would like to place, as it were, as being central to our discussion today, and try to go ahead from there. Now, the term Renaissance, first of all, let's start with that. As a label, that's, I think, perfectly acceptable. I mean, one can use labels of any kind, and I think that in the context of the European Renaissance, at any rate, when we say in the context of the European Renaissance, I mean, you can talk about other Renaissances. Some people talk about Renaissance in India, for instance, in something called something which is called the Bengal Renaissance, or other kinds of Renaissance. It's also a term which is used. But as again, I can say its principal use, its most well-known use is in the context of what is sometimes called European Renaissance. We'll talk a little bit about this. So it's a label, and it could thus talk about the events and processes, cultural events and processes happening in Europe in a certain period, that is to say, principally in the 15th and 16th centuries. That's what is called the Short Renaissance. And more extendedly, some scholars would say, from the 14th to the 17th century. That's the Long Renaissance. I think that there's some merit in pursuing the Long Renaissance. If we talk about the Renaissance at all, it may be a good thing to talk about a longer period of time. And it is, I think, for students of literature, well bracketed on two ends by two charismatic figures. One is the Italian humanist scholar and poet Francesco Petrarca, and in the end, by the English poet and revolutionary John Milton. Petrarch wrote in the early 14th century, started writing in the early 14th century. Milton died in, as many of you know, in 1674. That more or less for me would cover the time span that we might designate as a chronological label. Chronological labels are not that interesting. You can call anything or give it any kind of name. What difference would it make? Many scholars these days use the term early modern. Early modern, and evidently then there is this contrast between, or this division between pre-modern and early modern. So when we talk about what used to be called European Renaissance, they say this is early modern culture. That's fairly well established now. But here again there are problems because, as you know, one of the most difficult ideas to deal with in the whole of our profession's literary studies is to talk about modernity. What is modern? How does one talk about modern? Who is modern? So I won't go into the modern, pre-modern, post-modern, though it may come tangentially in our discussion. But again, as I say, that we are talking about events and processes happening over a fairly long period of time. And here, of course, even as I say that there are cultural events and processes, either the works that are published or events that happen, for instance, you might say that the the publication of a certain kind of poem or the recovery of a certain kind of text. That's one kind of thing. But also there are processes which are more difficult to describe in terms of just events. So there are processes which happen. Now, this is something, I mean, before going on, just say that however much we try to break up a continuity of development or continuity from that we call this way that we think about chronological time and try to record it in what we call history. That there is always going to be both continuity, aspects of continuity and change. Nothing happens that entirely changes things. And again, changes happen all the time. This is something that we have to bear in mind. But and so in order again to clear a space for ourselves, I'll say that it would be possible, and it has been done frequently, to talk about in this period, to talk about economic change, or the history of technology, or even the history of religion. Say, this is an interesting time in the history of Christianity, because it's ultimately it leads to what we call the Renaissance, also includes, and importantly, what we call the European Reformation. That's another important issue. So we could talk about religion and the church and what happened in religious life, so on. But we are not going to directly talk about these. We will talk about the arts, more or less, and try to understand events and processes which pertain most obviously to the sphere of what we might call the human sciences. Right. So the word Renaissance. The word Renaissance, as you know, means rebirth. Simple. No, there's no complication. There's no complex meaning to be gathered. It just means rebirth. It can be translated in different Renaissance as it's a term which is a spelling which is used, but it's, as you can gauge from the spelling, it's more or less a French. The word is modeled on the French form of a word that exists in many languages. At one time, it was quite popular to use the English form of this, which is Renaissance, Renaissance, Renaissance. Nascent, to be born, or being born. And this, there are forms of this in other languages as well, and ultimately they are taken from the term is essentially comes from Latin. So I'll come to that in a minute. So rebirth, Renaissance, rebirth. It's, as you can imagine, you can describe it as a vitalist metaphor. To be reborn, and when such it's not talking about rebirth in a biological sense, but it's talking about rebirth in a cultural sense. So cultural rebirth. So it becomes metaphorical, but metaphorical is a vitalist metaphor, which is drawn, as it were, from the sphere of biological. And I think that the most interesting thing about the use of this term would be to note that when one uses the term Renaissance, one is making two assumptions, which are backed into this. One is that in order to be reborn, something needs to have existed. Only something which existed can be reborn. or it would have just been war. It's not a birth, it's a rebirth. The second point is that at one point or at some time, what existed died or died out. And that this brings in the necessity or requirement or importance of the idea of rebirth. So there is birth, there is death. And even in the very simple and uncomplicated use of the word Renaissance, this triadic structure or this triadic context is being made effective. But this triadic context is being put forward. The next thing, I guess, would be to try to understand what was it that in this, if it is a renaissance, it is a renaissance of something. So what is it a renaissance of? And I'd like to note in a minute, I'll come to the first, as it were, recorded use of the word Renaissance in Italian, which is in the writings of the art historian Giorgio Vasari, V-A-S-A-R-I. I'll look these names up. I'll send you a reading list. In this work, which is one of the great monuments of Italian art history, written, which is called the Lives of the Artists, the Lives of Painters, Sculptors, and Architects, which was first published in the year 1550 by Vasari, who was himself a painter, but was more famous as because of this. He's more famous because of this book. And this contains biographies of all the major artists of its time, which is of immense value to us. He uses a phrase. The phrase is, again, I will ask you to note that this is not this cannot have been the first use of the term, but the first recorded, let's say the first time that we can find it actually written down. And so he talks about the renaissance of what? The renaissance of antiquity. That is the phrase that he uses, the renaissance of antiquity. Now let's try to work this out. So what is he talking about? By antiquity, he is referring to, or he's talking about, what we call the classical period. That is to say, the cultures, first of all of Greece, and then of Rome. Classical Greece. So that is what is referred to by this term antiquity. As many of you will know, that the Roman Empire fell, and then it was overrun by the Goths, and then it broke up, this vast empire, and there was a time of what you might call uncertainty and centralized power, as it were, became weak, and there were a number of smaller principalities, smaller territories which were controlled by other powers. So it's often talked about Germanic tribes, not strictly Germanic, there are others as well. We often think of Germany. So basically, this is what happened. The vast area which was controlled by the Romans, which covered so large a part of Europe and other places as well. Now, is broken up, and this is the prelude to what is called the Middle Ages. So, more or less, indeterminate period of time, sometime after the fall of Rome to when? To now. So when you talk about the rebirth, that we are living at a time where antiquity is being reborn, means that the depth of antiquity, the way in which the cultural practices of antiquity were discarded and forgot over a very long period of time, it must have been, anyway, you think about it, some 800 or 900 years. Some would apply the term Middle Ages to this whole period, some would restrict it to part of this period, but anyway, so you understand what I'm talking about. Sometime, essentially the Roman Empire, the fall of Rome. The fall of the Roman Empire is a long-drawn process. It didn't happen in a day. But what the fall of Rome is in the beginning of the 5th century. 5th century AD. But that's the famous sack of Rome by Alaric the God. But for some time after that, there were outposts of Roman powers that gradually collapsed. Some remained, some changed. So this went on for a couple of centuries more. And one important event, again, is making these points just to put some, as it were, landmarks. What I'm talking about is the coming, as it were, of I mean, one point I'd like to make here is that the idea of Europe, this is again a very important point, but again, among things which require a long discussion, which we can't do here, but just make this point in passing, perhaps you can look it up if you like. That, you see, what we call Europe is actually quite new. And certainly didn't exist before the 6th or 7th century AD. Before that, the Roman and Greek empires were essentially Mediterranean cultures. And this is again something that requires a great deal of study. So this what appears to us on the map as modern Europe came into prominence, came into, or came, as it were, became part of these cultural processes only from a later period, which I would say is 600, 700 AD onwards. Again, I'm being very, as it were, overgeneralizing things here. And one important event which I would like to mark is the installation and acceptance of the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, who more or less centralized power and brought warring tribes together and set himself up as the Holy Roman Emperor at the turn of the 8th and 9th centuries. So from then on, you can, I think, some people would say the Middle Ages begins with Charlemagne. That's not the theory. But I mean, for our purposes, of course, we are more interested in what happens at the when does this come to an end? And the end then is the here and now, where those who are writing, of course, Vasari is writing fairly late, 1550, as early as the beginning of the 14th century, in the poems of Petrarch. We are already familiar with the idea of something, a culture which is about to be reborn. Not just born, but reborn. What was dead, what was covered in these layers of what they called dismissively barbarism, is now going to be reborn. And this idea is perpetuated and repeated throughout is being perpetuated throughout perpetuating this idea of something of living through a break in history. This is the important point. So if there is some justification in calling the thinking of the Renaissance has had some real significance, it probably lies here in the way in which within the Renaissance, from its very inception, sometime in the 14th century, there is an awareness that something has changed. And this is a point which was made by the great art historian, modern art historian, Erwin Panofsky, in a landmark essay written in the 1930s or 40s, called, which is titled Renaissance and Renaissance in Western Art. It's a very famous essay, much referred to. I'll send the reference details when I have the chance. Panofsky, Panofsky. Panofsky is precisely making this point that in the Renaissance, what changes? I mean, there is a point where people stand and say that now we are in a new time. We are our time is different from the past. This idea of a break, this idea of a kind of historical perspective on the past is gained at this point in time. So this is again clear. Whether you accept it or not, it depends upon how you judge the material presented by Panofsky and discussed by other scholars subsequently. So this term, which then passes into currency, and since Vasari is used in the 16th century, the term the Renaissance of antiquity. So what is really meant by the Renaissance of antiquity? So I think that if I can just summarize one or two points that I made in this discussion. One is that the idea of the Renaissance, the idea of a rebirth, is there in the Renaissance, and Renaissance scholars and Renaissance poets have an idea of inhabiting a new time which is different from the past, a time where they have been able to relive or recapture something which existed at one time, but then was lost or forgotten. And it's here that the second part about the second question that I pose becomes important, and that's humanism. Again, here, there's a point about what does humanism mean, and in general way we have an idea of what humanism means. It's something, an extension of what we call human. We have other, as it were, ways of using this, humanitarian. But I guess that when we think about Renaissance humanism, we find that the meaning of Renaissance humanism is quite different from what you might expect. And that is, I think, what I would like to talk about. The rest of the meaning part of the lecture and how it came into being. This discussion was famously initiated by another great scholar, a contemporary of Panofsky, a man called P.O. Paul Oscar Christeller, Kristeller. Paul Oscar Christeller, who tried to understand what the content of Renaissance humanism. If you ask anybody, what is the common, as it were, thread which holds together the very diverse literary manifestations or cultural manifestations, artistic manifestations of Renaissance, perhaps one answer would be that they all draw upon common fund of humanistic ideas. What is this humanism? Where did it come from? That again will be a way of understanding the way in which Renaissance scholars are trying to recapture or repossess something that existed way back in the past, so far long ago, nearly a whole millennium, 800 or 900 years ago. As you said, as you saw, the fall of the Roman Empire. And so many centuries have passed. So what is being recovered? How can it be recovered? So this process is what will occupy us for the next hour or so. Which brings me to one point which perhaps I need to set out here and say that I don't. Sorry. That cough that I have. Anyway, so many textbooks or many even standard discussions of Renaissance humanism point to the conquest of Constantinople by Mehmed the Great. Eurocentric writers often say it's the fall of Constantinople. But it was also a great victory. It was a great military victory by a great conqueror, a great leader, Mehmed the Great of modern Turkey. This is in 1457. As you know, that is one of the great dates. And the theory is that many scholars ran away from Constantinople, where they lived with their classical texts, and they came to Italy, and it is here that the study of classical literature again became popular. But this is not exactly true. The recovery had started much earlier, and this is precisely, again, and this brings us back to what Steller is saying that when we talk about Renaissance humanism, we are not talking about human in any glorified. in any glorified sense, but it refers to a set of disciplines, of which the most important is rhetoric, and includes also history, and to a lesser degree poetry, some aspects of philosophy might also be important here, but these are based upon a study of classical writers. And this was what humanistic studies was about in the days. It was a program of studies which was based upon a study of classical texts, as I say, first primarily of rhetoric, also of history, poetry, to some degree of philosophy. This is a very, if you like, a very limited idea you might think, but actually, perhaps it's not. So let's see how this comes about. But this also, how did that come about? So was it that suddenly one fine morning, people started opening their classical works and started reading them? It doesn't happen like that. Again, as I say, the process is important. It's something which happens over many centuries. It has causes which are quite interesting in the sense that they are unusual and unexpected. And this is something which I'd like to say a little bit. This is start perhaps by saying that we're talking about the Middle Ages and the rise of the Holy Roman Emperor, the Holy Roman Empire. And in the succeeding centuries, from the 9th to the 12th, certainly, you find there are two great sources or two great structures of power. One is that which we call the empire, which is theoretically controlled at the top by the Holy Roman Emperor. And the other is what you might call the religious, which is controlled at the top by the Pope. So every human being, you might say, has an existence within the circuits, or as it were, the structure, which of these two structures. So every individual, you might say, has an existence on both of these. One in respect of this person's allegiance to the church, and one in respect of this person's allegiance to the Holy Roman Empire. So this is the way in which power is, as it were, allocated. This is again a wildly summarizing and simplifying, but something which used to be called study of feudal society, perhaps might like to think about great work on this is by a man called Marc Bloch, a French historian. Again, the theory of feudalism has been much opposed in modern time, but again, let's not get into these, but I think it's interesting. Issue itself so would require a separate study, but we're not getting into that. So what I'm trying to say is that there are these two great power structures where power is possessed by, or possessed, as it were, at the top by these two symbolic figures. One is the Holy Roman Emperor, the other is the Pope, and beneath them there are the functionaries, whole web of functionaries, and every human being is tied up, as it were, in a set of allegiances to these two sets. There's a set of allegiances that every individual has to the church, one set of allegiances that individuals have to their secular masters. That's how things are. Now, what started happening, and this is something which is interesting, sometime in the 12th century, but it is a growth in the importance of cities. And I was saying that these are fairly exclusive power structures. No other power structure exists, as it were. If any power structure you might think of, is related actually. So there are local kings or landlords or aristocrats, whatever. They have their place within the chain, or if there are bishops and curates and local religious figures, they have a place in that religious. And as individuals, men and women have their allegiances one way or the other to what I said. Right, so the rise of cities, and this is again something which has a number of, one is a set of economic factors which favors trade and commerce, and cities, which are, again, you will understand the importance of cities. The cities are centers for markets. Markets are where trade is conducted. They are also important for communications. These cities become more and more important and become, to some extent, they start claiming independence. They claim to be independent, as it were, centers of power. Of course, you might find that they pay their taxes to the Holy Roman Emperor and to the Church as required. They don't want to get into trouble. But they, for instance, set up their own constitutions. They have their own systems of governance. And most importantly, many of them keep their own armies. So they may say, for instance, that we are offering you this. If you ask for more, we will not give it. And if you want to take it, you will fight. And there was quite a number of such instances. The great place where you can study this the best is in that excellent work by the political theorist Quentin Skinner, called Foundations of Modern Political Thought. That's two-volume study. The first volume, in the opening chapters, he lays out this, because this is also the beginning of modern political theory. I'm not going to go into that aspect immediately, but just going to try to make a few points about the rise of humanistic studies and how that came about. So these cities become important, these cities become quite independent, they become powers unto themselves, they build relations with other cities, nationally and internationally, of course. That's another point. This is not a time where national identities exist in the same way that they did. So one city with another city. They engage in trade, and they make their routine, as it were, offerings to their nominal authorities, but they are, as it were, powers in themselves, quite independent. And what is interesting is that at the beginning, 12th century onwards, one finds that in most of these cities, they adopt republican forms of government. Say, elected forms of government. Later, in the 13th century, there's a lot of trouble, so we find that many of these cities fall into the hands of princes, and they are taken over by important families who assume control. That's a process which happens again. In order to know more about this political history of these cities, which is laid out again very brilliantly by Professor Skinner. But here comes the interesting part. So in order to run these cities, there's a requirement for a certain kind of person. What kind of person? Because, as you know, literacy rates are very poor. People may be literate or may not be literate. Let me just give you one small detail of mine. Shakespeare's father was not literate. Shakespeare's father signed legal documents with a mark of the pen. So literacy is very low. So you needed people, if you wanted to run the state, people who could read and write. Who could read and write. And it's here that this need for people, and principal reason is people had to write letters. Letters which would be sent, hey, the Holy Roman Emperor is asking for more taxes. Write him a letter saying that we won't pay them. B, we will have to send the letter to some other city saying that if you send me grain, I will send you wood. These kinds of letters. Then notices, regulations, laws, the later time histories of cities, and so on. A whole range of written work starting with letters. And this is the interesting part, that they suddenly find that these positions are being filled up by people who are skilled in the art of writing. And the language is very clear. All through Western Europe, the language is Latin. We first find this in northern Italy, but it spreads to other parts of Europe as well. So these cities employ these people, and these people are called, find this name being used, dictatores. Dictatores as writers, people who write. And they are seen as being expert, and this is something which, you see, it's a question of supply and demand. Because there is a demand for such individuals, these individuals start asking or finding ways of educating themselves. Universities start offering themselves, the whole University of Europe, Paris, Padua, Oxford, Cambridge, so many places, there were universities. And they start offering courses or training people in these arts, be able to read and write well in Latin. So this is codified in a body of studies which is called the Ars Dicta, ARS, Ars, which is the Latin word for art. The singular is Ars, the plural is artes, ARTES. The Ars Dictaminis, DICTAMINIS, Ars Dictaminis, Dictaminis, which comes from a late Latin word called dictamen, that word dictamen, which means letter. Dictamen is the art of letter writing. And this is the art which these individuals offer these cities, that I am skilled at letter writing, so employ me. And these faceless, most cases, entirely anonymous figures spread throughout the cities and become crucial to the running of cities. No. Power might change hands at the top, but these people remain the same. So this is, in a sense, the first major non-religious bureaucracy that we are witnessing in modern Europe. And what is important is that now the question arises is how that can one be better. So if there is a demand for it, then there are, as soon as there is a demand that so many people are appearing, so we can write, we can read. So how do you improve your Latin skills? And it is here that they started looking not at the medieval religious Latin, but at models of Latin which were more academic or more related to pedagogy. to say, the writings of classical masters. And in principle, one writer emerged as being the most popular and the most important and undoubtedly a central figure for the development of Renaissance humanism, which is also often called aftergate. This is Roman politician, philosopher, and orator Cicero, Cicero. And often Renaissance humanism is also called Ciceronian humanism. So they study and suddenly they start trying to get little bits out of Cicero, trying to work those stylistic tricks or stylistic features. There are other writers also, but Cicero is the most important. There is also Seneca, there is also the historians Livy and Sallust. But these are the authors who are being ransacked for tips on more effective communication. So this is more or less what these university courses are about, effective communication. So somebody is becoming a better teacher by training them out of Cicero than somebody who is not using Cicero. So you can write more effective, more elegant, more powerful letters because you have a greater command of the language, you have a greater rhetorical efficacy. Mind you, rhetoric in the classical period, you can't understand it now, but rhetoric was the most important of verbal skills, of linguistic skills. But it pertained to the spoken word. But when we see in the Renaissance, these rhetorical skills are being revalued. They are being revalued principally as the way that they pertain to writing, that which is written. It's a written skill. And this, as it were, this line between the spoken and the written is one which continues to perplex throughout the Renaissance. What is written? What is and so this brings me very near, as it were, the end of my talk. Right. So it is important, I think, then to understand that these ars determinism is, but please mind you that we are very far still from thinking about humanism. All we have said is that classical writers become important for certain purely practical reasons. Purely practical in making employment possible for people who try to model their style, who try to pick up certain linguistic traits or certain figures of speech, the use of certain figures of speech. What we would be familiar with as Alankar Shastra. Now, this is at times when, and as this becomes more and more important, I have two points to make which I will make at the end. I don't think that's to make that, but I want to make a couple of points before that. One point is this, that at one point throughout this process, so at the beginning of the 12th century, so perhaps somewhere down the line, what happens, of course, is that the study of the classics becomes important not just for practical reasons, but because the people who read them suddenly find that they are important in themselves. They are not just something that you get a couple of tips out of, but there is something. You want to study them in entirety. You want to study them as a whole. This also is, this is something which is important. I mean, many of the Roman texts survived from Roman times as aids to education, where we learn Latin from part of pedagogic programs in small fragments. Many of the texts were retained in medieval libraries. And there begins, I think, from the end of the 13th century, this process of discovery and recovery of classical works. And there is still time, of course, before printing, so if work is discovered, it is copied, it is read, it is circulated among groups. From there, there are fairly small spheres of circulation. It's not easy to get hold of a manuscript. Getting hold of a copy of a manuscript is quite difficult. But still, there is a greater frequency of discovery of important Latin texts. Now, they were always there, but suddenly they become important, and because they become important, they become visible. So now, medieval libraries are being scoured for what we could claim this process is very important in the 14th century. Petrarch, great poet Petrarch himself, was great, made many important, number of important discoveries. Found texts of Cicero, which he studied carefully. So this is a way in which, at a time when these authors are becoming important in themselves, this is often referred to as the shift from the classics as being part of purely a pedagogic practice to the classics as becoming important in themselves. And this is the moment, you might say, where humanism, humanistic studies, is properly born. This is the shift which is often referred to as the shift from the artes to the autores. Autor, author, plural autores. So a study of Cicero, the importance of Cicero and the cultural valuation of these. It may have been that the Renaissance continually overvalues these, but this is part and parcel of classical education. So from then onwards, you might say that what is the bedrock of education throughout Europe are study of classical authors, a certain body of classical authors, and whether you think of painting or of poetry or of philosophy or of history or of anything else, or for that matter of the sciences, we'll find that all individuals have, at one point of time, or have more or less assume that they have undergone some degree of training in the humanistic disciplines. Why are they what they called humanistic? That's something because this was referred to in Latin as the distinction between the literary humaniores. Literary humaniores meaning studies which are more human, to which you might say that one way of putting it would be to say the human sciences, as opposed to technical studies. Again, I was talking about the universities. Previously, in the university, you went to study, one went to the university to study religion, to become a priest. Or one went to the university to study two other subjects. One being law, become a lawyer, or medicine, become a doctor. Universities in the Middle Ages did not offer courses in other subjects, in science or arts. So it's here that one important point becomes evident. That with the coming, from the time of the dictatores, till the time of the full-fledged humanist scholars who start reading and valuing, studying, commenting on classical authors, there is the discovery and creation of a space of secular study which did not exist in the past, which is both non-technical, it's non-legal and non-medical, and non-religious, that is to say, non-theological. That space is the literary humaniores, the more human studies, by which the Romans referred to the study of rhetoric, history, so on. And that is what is sought to be recovered, and this is what Renaissance humanism as a pedagogic program refers to. So the first point I wanted to make, I've already made, is that what is significant at this point of time is the discovery and valuation and strengthening of a space of secular intellectual activity, where you can be previously see those who had learning either went into the service of princes or most went into the church. But now there is something which is purely a form of activity which is valued in itself for its for a set of linguistic and literate, what you might call literate skills. And that is a sphere which will be of great importance in understanding the character of the European Renaissance. The second point that I want to make is a more speculative point. And this is, you might say that this is my own obsession, you might say. I think that this is also the time when we are witnessing the birth of the intellectual. The intellectual as being an independent entity who is not tied down to an establishment and who is also mobile and can move from one place to another place. Because you often see that these dictatores, they move from one court to another court. When they were, say, in Padua, they wrote in defense and in praise of Padua. When they went to, say, some other city like Florence, they wrote in praise of Florence. So this might seem to you to be purely opportunistic, but that's not the point. The point is that there is a certain class of people who have these skills which they carry within themselves, and they operate, as it were, without any necessary grounding in any institution. And they can work within different environments. This appears to me to be one important point, which is valuable in understanding the emergence of the European intellectual. I don't know whether you have read or if you have read or know about a book called The Intellectuals and the Masses by well-known professor, English, called John Carey, taught in Oxford University for a very long time. And this is a very well-known book and quite a shocking book. He's talking about 19th century, early and late 19th and early 20th century England, mostly England. And he's saying that in most of the writers of this time, the great intellectual masters of this time, there is a fear and resistance and almost aversion to the masses. The intellectuals and the masses are, as it were, opposed. The masses are what the intellectual continually saying are the cause for trouble, confusion, ill education. The masses become the site, as it were, of all that is wrong with England. Now, this is, you might say, the most, as it were, darkest phase. But it begins, I think, here in early Renaissance Europe, in a much more humble manner. But the point which is important then is that these individuals are not rooted in particular environments, which makes them independent. Because they are independent, there are certain problems with understanding how these intellectual functions with regard to the rest of society. So I'll stop here because this is a point which is, I think, I've left it hanging, but perhaps intentionally so. So I'll be very happy for questions and comments, and if anybody asks me. So, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We begin with the questions. I would like to invite Vivek sir to share his views.
Yes.
Professor, I can't, like overwhelming by the response that we got from our students, and I'm sure that they were quite happy to listen to you. And then to the topic that we chose was quite interesting and obviously fitting to their interest as well for their academic and as well as for their research pursuits. The one thing, like if I keep speaking, and it's already 1:07, and then we have to close the session by 1:30 because like we were not even well, but you happily agreed to our invitations, so I'm grateful to that. So the point is that when we're talking about it, a certain thing that crossed to my mind, which I want you to speak on, make some couple of points so that that will clear the doubts of my students. The one is that uh, if we learn about the period following the decline of Rome, the less dark and uncultured it appears, and when we inquire more into it, what is reborn in the 14th and 15th century is that more we become aware of the vital continuities with the past. And I'm sure that, if I could catch your intention when you were speaking it up, that when we're looking at the Renaissance, do we see obviously one break, but at the same time we could see the continuities with the things that was going on.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Right. I understand your question. Let me try to answer this. One is the point is that the answer, one way I would like to start is by saying is that by no means, by modern estimations, is there ever a period of darkness or vulgar or doom? It's simply that new, different bodies of knowledge grow because the growth of the decline of classical studies is parallel with the rise of Christian culture. And from the third, fourth century onwards, there are these immense bodies of writing in Christianity which continue right through this time till the 7th, 8th centuries, and then again. That is a whole different body. Then there are also places where independently, for instance, there is the history, the Byzantine history of Byzantine Greece, which is in itself very important, and there is a lot of study which is going on. So actually, again, this whole totalizing idea that was propagated at the time of the Renaissance, that there was this period of darkness, is not correct. It is, by modern standards, it is not correct. It is simply the way that they were seeing something which had been lost was being recovered. That's one thing. And I think that you are absolutely right in saying that these changes or these sudden eruptions happen not just once, but over and over again. And right through this period, there is, for instance, in the 8th century, there is what's called the Carolingian Renaissance, which happened in the court of Charlemagne, where Charlemagne had many scholars who were interested in classical studies, so they copied some classical texts. Then it happened again in the 12th century, the 13th century, and so on. So this was going on happening. And there was, as it were, some form of cultural activity with regard to classical texts happening all the time. So that is not in doubt. But it's simply that a new kind of historiographic understanding is being promoted at the time. So this is the problem.
Yeah. I mean, I have a couple of things to know, but I think I would ask Baisakhi to switch to students because their interest matters more than mine, and my inquiries are not important right now.
We can go on later.
Yes, yes. Okay, Baisakhi, could you please read the questions for the students that we have?
Sure, sir. So the first question is by Miltonic. So in your essay entitled Homer's Ghost, Petrarch and you have shown how Pigman's three forms of imitation can be applied to Petrarch's Africa. Don't you think that these modes of imitation can be found in most of the plays of Shakespeare too?
Well, I think that the difference between the big difference between Petrarch and Shakespeare is that Petrarch was more consciously, I think, more conscious of his classical models. In the case of Shakespeare, you see, Shakespeare had some, in the case of drama, there are some problems because one does not know, to be very frank, regarding Shakespeare's first-hand acquaintance with classical drama. It's never fully been understood because he was fairly proficient in Latin. Let's say he had as much Latin as a schoolboy who had gone through grammar school education would have. He was not a scholar, but he was, of course, a genius. That's a different thing. So he understood many things intuitively from, and also by conversation. It's entirely ignored or underestimated source of that is that through conversation with others. You may have learned a great deal. Now, that he knew a little bit about Renaissance literary criticism is evident from a play like Hamlet, for instance, where there is a discussion of whether Prince Hamlet talks about how acting should be done and what the correct function of art is. But I think that Shakespeare himself, it is very difficult to extrapolate a kind, an artistic field from Shakespeare. This is singular. It is possibly easier in the case of Johnson. who appears to have had more evident classical models. For instance, it is quite clear that Johnson was aware of the place of Aristotle in some work on that. But in the case of Shakespeare, it's I think, difficult to estimate whether anything about Shakespeare is different. But particularly difficult, I would say, to think of the way in which he uses classical models. I don't think that can be easily answered. There is one essay which I refer to, which I think is interesting. You might like look at by this guy called Robert Weeman, appeared in Shakespeare Court in the 1990s somewhere. It begins with Weeman, W-E-I-M-A-N-N. And I think that's the name. Please correct me. The title is Bifold Authority. Bifold Authority, which I think is the most interesting way of looking at what you are saying, is that at one point he starts with by citing something which Stephen Greenblatt says, is that throughout Shakespeare's play, there is not a single assertion or denial of authority which is unquestioned or which you can attribute to Shakespeare himself. That's to say, Lear says something, or Hamlet says something, or Macbeth says something. But does Shakespeare say these things? Or what does Shakespeare say about authority? This is something which I could think is a very interesting, and Iman goes on to study this aspect of the way of understanding Shakespeare's play. And it's more, of course, not just Shakespeare's plays, but more Swedenborg. So I think that if you look at that, you might find a very roundabout way of getting to this one. But coming back to Goodman's article and Petrarch's understanding of classics is, I think, on the whole, different from Yes.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Amar Chakraborty. What were the interests of the humanists? How were female humanists treated?
That's two separate questions. Let me try to take them separately. One is that the interests of the humanists. You might say that it's something like having a common core, but then spreading out in many directions. Because the common core evidently would be that bedrock of humanistic education, the programs of study that were adopted in schools and were adopted by scholars themselves. Because in many ways, as I said, that even till a very long time after, such study was not available easily in universities. Universities were still dominated by older curricula. There is evidence, for instance, that Francis Bacon, when he went into great scientific revolutionary in the sense that he wanted a more scientific attitude. His own scientific beliefs might difficult to understand, but anyway. So what I'm trying to say is that he was the popularizer of the scientific attitude. So Francis Bacon went to university and was deeply disappointed by the fact that still they were studying Aristotle's views of science, and whereas so much had changed and there were so many newer sources available. So I think that it is important to understand that from a common base, it spreads out in many directions, and in fact, there are so many separate areas which flower in the Renaissance which are apparently quite new, for instance, and so many professions which are so. One is, of course, the sciences, technology, one area. Then there are the arts. That's another area, the arts, the visual arts, which is something. Now, it's not saying the visual arts didn't exist before, but evidently the nature of the visual arts and the relationship of the artist to society changes most importantly. And one aspect here, which might be of interest to you, is that one of the points that one might make about the difference between medieval art and Renaissance art is that the medieval artist is an anonymous artist. It is not the contribution of the mason who works on sharp cathedral, or the person who gives a form, is either not known at all or known very, as it were, very, maybe have been some kind of religious function. The person who actually planned it. We know the names of some people who planned some of the cathedrals. But my point is that the idea of the artist, painter, sculptor, the architect as artist, is something which comes into being in the Renaissance. That's one point that you might. And as I say that there were so many different things in so many areas that it is not possible, I think, to talk about, give a whole list of activities. But if you look at the gamut of Renaissance studies, you will find that there are so many things which begin at this time and have something. One point I would like to make, however, is that in the case of scientific studies, in spite of the great importance of the work of Galileo and Copernicus, and of course of other important thinkers like Harvey or Gilbert, Botticelli, there were a lot of it requires not a couple of generations, not until the 17th century, that one comes to what is called the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution is more about the Enlightenment, not so much about the rest. This is a point you might like to consider. The second question that you asked regarding female humanists, then I think this is a classic essay which was still very well worth reading. It's become quite classic by a scholar called Joe Kelly. Joe Kelly Gadol, later became, which says that did women have a Renaissance? Title of the article, did women have a Renaissance? The answer is mostly no. Most of the avenues of knowledge were shut to women, but because of their exceptional talent, some women who exceptional talent or ability were able to both acquire and exercise this skill, and this has leads us to the body of writings, for instance, poetry of Renaissance women writers in Italy and England and France. That's one. There are some painters in Italy. There are many scholars know about. But as, again, a matter of shame, I guess, and a matter of regret, is that most of the avenues of study which were available to men were not available. But please do read John Kelly's article.
Thank you, sir. The next question is by Sudeshna Mukherjee. If Renaissance had begun earlier, what role has the fall of Constantinople in it? If you could please elaborate.
Yes. Well, again, I say that perhaps for us, as as Asians would perhaps say, the conquest of Constantinople. Anyway, whatever. Now, the events leading up to the gradual threat of the attack of the Turks and the increasing crisis of Constantinople made it safer for many scholars to move to Western Europe and seek accommodation in Italian cities where they were given a warm welcome, principally because they brought with them classical work and texts. Now, there is a point here that many of the texts that came to this source were Greek texts. You will note that I was talking about Latin culture. Sorry. Now, the knowledge of Greek was far less common in the Renaissance. And what is interesting is that Latin Greek scholars were given great importance. There were many of them were culturally important figures. Petrarch had a Greek teacher. Doesn't know exactly how much he was able to read, because otherwise, how would you read Homer? Okay. Any classical Greek literature, but in the turn of the century, let's say late 14th or 15th century, there were two brothers who arrived in Florence, who were the Chrysoloras brothers, Chrysoloras. John Chrysoloras and Emmanuel Chrysoloras, who were Greek teachers in the first generation of Italian humanists of the 15th century. Many of them received their Greek training from these two scholars. So, what I'm trying to say is that well before 1457, there was a fair amount of classical texts available. Scholars who had already moved, and might say that what happened in 1457 was it simply accentuated this movement, and evidently the recovery of texts at this time is Greek text is very, very important. There's so many more Greek texts arrived in Italy at this time. It also would, if you think that this is the time more or less, 1450, around 1450, is the discovery of the printing press, the discovery of movable type. That becomes also important because these 50 years are preparatory, and by the beginning of the 16th century, we are seeing printing full swing, and so many of the Greek texts are now being first printed and then translated, or first translated and then printed. First printed in translation, then. So, a vast amount of classical literature in place in translation. So I would say, to go back to your question, that the process was accentuated, but it was not caused by the liberation. Yes.
Thank you, sir.
Professor Amlan, we have discussed what is already 1:30. So I'm sorry, the people who asked question like Shivam, Kusumika, and Shruti, right? And Professor Amlan is not going anywhere, right? We will call him again, and he would be with us. And then we will just have a question and answer session, right? Next time I
No
will.
problem.
Next time we will just have a question and answer session. So my apologies with you guys. And if you have a questions more, but you know that's already 1:30, and we all need to finish this session. And as I promised, we will definitely call him next time, and we will have just question and session. Then you can ask as many questions, wide range, diversities, whatever you like to have. Right? So, Basaki, close the session.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir. I,
Thank you
on
very much.
behalf of on behalf of intersections, extend profound gratitude to all those who assisted in achieving such a pronounced outcome of this lecture. Firstly, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation and sincere thanks to our chief speaker, Professor Amlan Dasgupta. Thank you, sir, for such an enthralling and thought-provoking talk on Introduction to Renaissance Literature, where you talked about Renaissance humanism and rise of humanistic studies, and Renaissance being associated with so much more. We learned the other side, which may never have crossed our mind. We learned the aspect that we were unaware of with such ease. Thank you so much, sir. I would like to take this opportunity to place our record of hearty thanks to Dr. Vivek Singh. Sir, it's solely because of your endeavor that this online lecture stands viable. Thank you so much, sir. I also extend my thanks to all the participants for their gracious presence and enormous cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.